Of course you are. Let's give a massive cheer to Bruno Vincent, who's going to come and talk about the Copper Scroll of Qumran.
Thanks. Oh, this time has started. I was going to start by saying, following on from someone such a wonderful public speaker as Clarissa is incredibly irritating. I'm going to talk to you about the Dead Sea Scrolls. No, hang on. I'm going to tell you about how many genuine treasure maps do you think have ever been found in the world? Ever? 8? How much? 20? 1! Until last year. There's now 2, annoyingly. There were some Nazis stole some gold and left some maps for each other. It was only discovered last year. But until very recently, there had only genuinely been one actual treasure map in history. And I'm going to tell you about it. It was part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But first, I should maybe bring us up to speed with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've all heard of them. I didn't know very much about them until a couple of years ago. In the winter of 1946 to 47, a Bedouin goat herd named Mohammed the Wolf, and he's there on the right, looking splendid, pretty sexy actually. I think he was actually only 16 at the time, so this photograph, of the discovery. Come on, guys, time's... He was chasing one of his goats and threw a rock through an entrance to a cavern, and it heard a clink, and he discovered 4 pots with entire scrolls in them. They were immediately sold onto the black market, and after it had been discovered that they were written in ancient Hebrew, and they were obviously exceptionally valuable, and Israeli scholars desperately wanted to get hold of them, and had to get hold of them by tracing them to New York, and they eventually bought them by subterfuge when they were advertised in the Wall Street Journal, because the people trying to sell them couldn't find buyers amongst American universities. And so they bought them, and they started to be studied. The Dead Sea Scrolls were all found in the same place, around a place called Qumran. And archaeological expeditions over between 1947 to 1956 found 11 caves with with 900 documents. Am I speaking loudly enough? Yes. Good. 900 documents in 15,000 fragments, lots of them bitten by rats. 21% of them were biblical texts. The latest of them was dated to the 1st century AD or CE. The ones that weren't biblical texts were community rules, legal documents, poems. But once they had been discovered after 1947 and 1952 and 1953, there was this feeling of danger that lots of the major religions of the world might have to be rewritten. That the oldest existing Bible, dated to 999 AD or CE. I'm going to say AD. I normally say CE, but for fuck's sake. So here, all of a sudden, were documents that were 1,000 years earlier than the latest surviving documents. And they might reveal changes that had happened in the interim. It turned out, after the documents had been studied, that they didn't. That all of these biblical books the books, the scrolls and documents discovered in all these caves around Qumran contained all of the books of the Bible except for Esther, for some reason. And none of them had any changes whatsoever. They had all been absolutely exactly copied for 1,000 years. And so all of the fear that religions might alter was unfounded. That's right, I start to resent Clarissa's. There we go. So Qumran, it was only 20 miles away from Jerusalem. And it was a deserted place, which some people thought was a perfume factory. Some people thought was a private Roman villa. And it's still not entirely sure. But all of the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in this area, in caves around this spot. Which was basically the home of a pious, frugal, religious sect called the Essenes, who were around from about the 1st century BC until the 1st century AD. And it was completely deserted in AD 68 after the Jewish revolt. The Jewish revolt happened in 66 against the Romans, and the Romans were basically on their way coming to just destroy everything, because Herod, they had been, what would you call it, like there had been a sort of, a held state, and now they had revolted, and the Romans were coming to destroy it. All of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written on ink, in ink on parchment or papyrus, with one exception, which is the Copper Scroll, which is what I'm going to tell you about. On March 20th, 1952, on a ledge in Cave 3 behind a rockfall, was found 2 pieces of copper. They were completely oxidized after 2,000 years, and obviously it was feared they would crumble if anyone touched them. They were taken to Manchester University, sprayed with adhesive to stop them shattering, and sliced into 23 segments by a very delicate process using a device that was normally used to put the slit into pen nibs. That's not 23, that's the first scroll. There were 2 scrolls. The entire scroll was 8 feet long, 30 centimeters high. That's 8 feet and 30 centimeters. That's 2 different unit measurements, but you can handle it. It's one of the largest inscriptions on metal that's ever been discovered. And when the contents were read, they were found to be descriptions of 64 hiding places of large amounts of gold, silver, precious metals. Every single description follows a formula, but they are all maddeningly vague. For instance, in the place of the 2 reservoirs is one. Under the threshold of the crypt is another, followed by an amount of gold, an amount of precious metal. In the salt pit, which is beneath the steps. Why? Why were they so vague? For instance, location 44 out of 64 says, in the enclosure of the waters that are close to the vault of the drain, at the broad place of the outflow, dig 7 cubits. There you will find 9 talents. A cubit was 18 inches, a foot and a half. So this says you have to dig 10.5 feet down into the desert, possibly through stone. These vague instructions led to decades of speculation as to the exact whereabouts of all of these treasures. Also, a talent. No one can quite agree as to what a talent means. So therefore, the entire treasures in lots of ancient writings, they vary, but basically, a talent was the amount that a man could carry, and it was thought to be 70 pounds or 5 stone. So therefore, a talent meant 5 stone. This meant that the initial estimates were that the entire treasures mentioned were 44 tons of gold, 65 tons of silver, which would be worth, and lots of other precious metals, which would be worth 2.4 billion pounds today. Qumran was in Jordan, and so these scriptures were handed over to Christian experts, despite the fact they were obviously ancient Hebrew texts, essential to Judaistic understanding. And they couldn't be understood except by an exceptionally slow, meticulous process. And it was frustrating for everyone. Decades passed after the 1940s and 1950s, and actual explications of these documents were not released. The truth is that the Copper Scroll, in particular, they didn't want to be true. They didn't want it to be a real treasure map. The last thing anyone wanted who took all of these scriptural artifacts seriously was that hundreds of people start turning up and digging up precious places and destroying incredibly important artifacts. So therefore, the team in charge, Father Joseph Milik was particularly in charge of the Copper Scroll, and he said it described purely imaginary treasure, part of Jewish folklore, and there was reason to support that. The New York Times, when it was first remarked upon in 1956, the New York Times said it was like something from a Robert Louis Stevenson story. Well, that's a kind of circular thinking. Robert Louis Stevenson had been around in the 19th century, not 2,000 years earlier. So who had actually done this? Is it real? Oh, that's the whole thing. It's rather beautiful. It was pieced together in a rather clever process by, of all people, fucking EDF. Fucking electronic company. And that now exists in Paris. And that was the silicon molds were placed on things and then it was recast and so forth. The copper used was 99% pure, extremely expensive and very difficult to get hold of at the time, in the 1st century AD. It was written on with a chisel and hammer, a clumsy, difficult process. And studies have shown that the author of this thing was illiterate. They were copying something. They had been chosen because they could not read. And there are 4 different handwriting styles across the whole document, which tends to suggest that it was an important thing for a particular reason. There are 30 spelling mistakes. Some letters are 5 times the size of other letters. So it seems as though it's illiterate. Also, the original experts on the Dead Sea Scrolls, who really did not want this to be a real, dismissed this as folklore. But no folklore has ever been as tedious as 64 instructions of where to dig for things. There are no characters. There's no story. It is just a sequence of directions. One expert said, to characterize its style as merely prosaic is to exaggerate its literary quality. It seems very likely that basically this is the treasure of the Second Temple of Jerusalem, which they were very, very anxious to hide, as they knew that after the Jewish revolt of 66 AD, that the Romans were coming to take over the city and to destroy lots of things. And it had to be done in a hurry. And the writing of it reflects that. It's done rushed and with mistakes and was peculiar. But the consensus among experts is that it is now considered to be genuinely a real treasure map that refers to actual locations where treasure was hidden. I've got 2 minutes. Thanks. I'm going to rush through. The people who went searching for the treasure, a bunch of basically bonkers white guys. John Allegro, a moral, manipulating self-publicist. He helped cut the scroll in 1956, but then cozied up to the King of Jordan, did some digs around the Valley of Achor, found nothing, went mad, wrote a stupid book about how all religion is based on magic mushrooms. The second was Professor Vendell Jones, a bad-tempered, self-aggrandizing ex-Baptist minister and archaeologist who, when he was still in the womb, was preached to by his mother using a paper funnel to preach. Anyway, it turns out he was a dickhead as well. He was thrown out of Italy, not Italy, he may have been, but he was thrown out of Israel after the authorities realized that he had used a bulldozer to help excavate a road to where he wanted to get to. And George Lucas and Steven Spielberg were obliged to say publicly Indiana Jones was not based on him. Third was Bob Morgan, a Continental Airlines pilot from Missouri, who found an amazing 300 feet deep tunnel that went all the way down. Anyway, he dug it out, and you could see the North Star from the bottom of the... Anyway, he financially exhausted himself for doing that, but he didn't find fuck all. Went home penniless. And lastly, there was Jim Barfield, a charismatic ex-fire marshal from Oklahoma, who sounds like an absolute dreamboat. Sounds like really charming. Everyone seems to like him. And he thought all of the treasures were found in the original Qumran area that I showed you in the first place. He thought all of them, instead of being around Jerusalem, they're all found there. And he smuggled a metal detector in, and he claims that basically he's got readings that there's 2.5 million pounds worth of precious metal under there. There you go. That's it. But hang on, stop clapping. Oh, I've done my time. Shut up. The final location, number 64 on the scroll says, in the cavity, in the bright place. No, don't laugh at the word cavity, Steve. In the cavity, in the bright place north of Koklit, a duplicate of this document, and an explication, and their measurements, and a detailed inventory of everything one by one. So there was another scroll that gave all of the details. And the final thing, which is a very common sense resolution of this mystery to me, is the fact that only about 30 years later, in 106 AD, there was a kingdom called Dacia in what is now Romania. And the Romans were coming. They knew they were coming. And the king didn't want them to discover their treasures. And the king diverted a river, buried all of the treasures that were precious to them in the center of that river, and then re-diverted the river over it, and then killed everyone who had worked on that process, and then committed suicide in order to prevent their treasures ever being found by the Romans. And the Romans still found the treasures. So a common sense resolution is that Romans good at finding treasure, aren't we? Thanks very much. Nice to see you. Oh, thanks.